Hello and welcome back to the Electrify News podcast. I am Matt Teskey, and today we are joined by a special guest and someone whose name has been in motorsports for a long time. And really, I think everybody's going to get a kick out of this conversation because mainly this is someone who knows what it means to be behind the wheel of not just any car, electric or gas, but this is the world he's lived in for a long time. It's Tanner Foust. Tanner, thanks for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So, first question I think is that I would like to ask you. Number one, just being your history with everything you've done, is how are we going to get Adam Ferreira to get out of a Buick and into an electric
car? Yeah, it's a good question. I'm amazed we got him out of a Cadillac. It's all he talked about was Cadillacs. And it's funny if you talk about car enthusiasts in general. I mean, go to Cars and Coffee on a Saturday morning or whatever. There's so much influence that we get from our parents on our car tastes. Yeah. And for Adam, in Adam's case, it was his dad used to work on some cars and loved Cadillacs. I'm pretty sure he comes from a mafia background. He just always sounds like he's speaking like a kind of an Italian English version of mafia language. And they just like Cadillacs. That's just, that his dad taught him that. And that's so I'm not sure you're going to see Adam in an electric car. And he's not great with electronics anyway.
He's very old school. Like he's got the, when he says he has his car phone with him, it's like a legit rotary phone in the old Cadillac kind of thing.
Yeah. You try to take a selfie with the guy and it's like a 5-minute thing. So it's not, oh, whoa, just took a picture of the tree. Hold on. Whoop, that's me. How did I get a picture of my shoe on there? It's that sort of a thing. And so, yeah, I don't know if he'd figure out all the minutia of an electric car, but he does love to drive. So that's what's important.
And that's it, right? He's a car guy at heart. And I think the reason why I wanted to open up with that one is that he's oddly enough my favorite comic of all time. And you've got a chance to work with him extensively. I met him years ago at the Portland Auto Show and had a chance to walk around with him. And I told him that. He's like, wait, which routine of mine did you fall in love with? And it was from like 25 years ago. And he was like, man, he's like, wow, dude. So it was fun. But then we got to talk cars all day. And that was one of the things we talked about and I think he represents kind of that culture. Like you said, it's like family culture of like, they're a caddy family. Like there's GM families, there's Ford families, there's all these things. And that's part of that conversation with EVs is these legacy brands that have been around for so long that have so much heritage to them. They're now doing that pivot. And we've seen a lot of them they've kind of tried to take that heritage forward with the Mustang Mach-E, for example. They're attaching what is the future of their vehicle platforms to a heritage brand. I guess what's your thought on that? Do you think that's going to be something that will work for all of them? Are there only some do you think that can transition, or is it more of a mix?
I'll be honest, I'm not a fan. I'm not a fan of, like the Corvette SUV coming out. Don't call it a Corvette. It's I get it. I mean, I saw Tommy Boy. I know that Callahan Auto Parts are a premium brand, and so somebody's going to come in there and use that premium brand name to add value to the crap that's on the shelf. But not saying that's what Ford Chevy did, but I'm just saying that using the brand Mustang and Corvette, which really was built out of the hot rod days, was built out of modification. It was right in the early days of modifying your car, street racing, and discovering your freedom and expressing yourself through the performance of a pony car. That DNA is rich and deep, and it's a part of Americana history, really. And to cash in on it, to sell something that's the same platform as a Jimmy or a Tahoe or whatever, I don't know. It just, there is business-wise, it may be what needs to happen, but there's something that just rubs me a little bit wrong in that way. But that being said, I am a big proponent to anything that keeps people interested in cars, interested in the craft of driving and their skill set that they hold within themselves. And so if they need to be inspired by a brand name to buy something and feel like they own something that harkens back to, the childhood dream of owning a Corvette, but this way they get an SUV out of it also and can pick up, groceries, then great. It's, it's all about getting people out on the road to take advantage of the ribbon of highway that's been laid out for us. So that's what I'm still about.
Well, and to your point, it's kind of like walking that fine line of maintaining that authenticity of what the brand and the vehicle platform has been. And I agree with you. It can dilute what the heritage is. It's you're just basing it purely off the brand name and purely off the nameplate. And we've already seen the uproar from people that are steeped in the history of some of these nameplates that are saying you can't do that. Now, corporate America is going to do what they want, obviously, because at the end of the day, they have to transition into where this is going. But I think there's more opportunity, kind of like Volvo. Volvo sort of did that with Polestar, where they leveraged something that was internal, but they made it a brand new element of a platform and really
Mm.
gave it its own face as a platform.
Mhm.
And maybe that's the angle to take. I still think GM had a huge opportunity with bringing back Saturn as their pure electric line. I thought that would have been great. But I mean, that's the thing is the and we've talked this oftentimes on the show is that the history of how people think of Americana and being on the road and those brands that made it possible. And this is a huge pivot for brands that have to reimagine how they paint the picture for the future of basically brand enthusiasm. And EVs are a part of that. So yeah, connecting the dots there, I think, yeah, they're going to be walking that line of basically pissing some people off and exciting some people, right?
Yeah, there was a meeting I was in not too long ago, and I was racing rallycross, which is high energy, small literage, perfect sport for electric because very short heat races, etc., and a young demographic. Back when I was racing for Ford, we'd gotten Ford involved in rallycross by
Mm,
doing the Pikes Peak Hill Climb with a rallycross car, and then that ended up leading to a title sponsorship of X Games, and there was a lot of great excitement about rallycross. And then when we were talking about electrification some 3, 4, 5 years ago,
mhm.
somebody in the room, a guy named Yost Capito, who was running Volkswagen Motorsport at the time, said, I'm not sure why we're talking about racing cars anymore. It's all going to be SUVs, by the time this actually
Oh,
happens. We need to be talking about the replacing this idea that we're going to be racing hatchbacks to racing small SUVs.
yeah.
And every manufacturer that was represented in the meeting just sort of like, yeah, 5 years, we're not talking cars anymore either. And
But that
that's
turns
just,
a lot of it on its head, though, right? I mean, everything they've known about even just like the layout of the vehicle. I mean, weight ratio, how they design the structure of the car. I mean, that changes how you're building a race program completely, right?
yeah, well, those cars were based on the chassis, on the stock chassis. So it
Yeah,
wasn't like a tube frame, start from scratch kind of a thing.
yeah,
But it was more about the size of the vehicle needed to be something that could represent or manufacturers could customize to meet their SUV look. And that for me was just an interesting realization that the manufacturers really, I mean, yes, you have some manufacturers that are still steeped in sports car
yeah,
world, but watching what we consider to be kind of the primary sports cars in the US, the Mustang and the Corvette, turn towards SUVs is just a telltale sign. And
yeah,
it just makes it feel more important to me than ever to I guess, keep going to the cars and coffees, keep inspired to drive because we could be one of the last generations, if not this, the next generation is probably the last generation to be able to take responsibility for ourselves driving a car
right.
in a city anyway. But
Yeah,
so it's important to hold on to that human potential that we created and that freedom that we created. That's why I have a pilot's license. That's why I like to do these things where you kind of take control of your own A to B. And driving for you, probably like me, was a turning point in my life
yeah,
where suddenly the world was open and it really was a defining moment getting a driver's license, and it's sad to see
yeah.
that maybe not be the case in the future.
Actually, you bring up a good point. Actually, and I've talked about this over the years with a lot of different people I know in the industry for auto. Is that, and actually, I put something up on LinkedIn years ago about how the cell phone changed the automotive industry forever. And you just hit up the nail on the head for what I used to, touch on is the fact that it was access to the world by getting your license. That's how you
Yeah.
could go and see things, right? That's what our generations grew up with. And now you have this digital window into the world for going and seeing what the world can offer you through a smartphone, and younger people are not seeing the same value as needing to be able to get a license to go out and experience things. They feel they experiencing it, through a digital interface. And partly, what's funny is electric cars are a weird mix of that, right? It's that digital interface, but you're also still physically moving. So it's this interesting blend in that way. But I've heard people say, well, that means that young people are never going to get their license. I think it's just going to be delayed. I think that, and maybe that's a bad thing, or I don't know if it's a good thing, because they're not going to be so young that they maybe shouldn't have a license at 16. Because you and I probably had friends that got their licenses at 16 that should have never been driving, but then
Yeah.
there's moving forward, they're going to be potentially going through college and getting their life started, and then realizing, well, I probably shouldn't, get ride hail to go to the grocery store, or if I want to go on vacation, I'm going to have to like either fly or get a car. So maybe we're just pushing out how long people are going to have that same attention and love for cars, but that directly dictates how these brands have to think of, well, when do we capture people's imagination then with our brand and our new vehicle, right? Because
Yeah.
it's not as a childhood thing, maybe it's just different. And so again, I totally appreciate and agree with what you're saying about that.
Yeah, you wonder. I mean, if you really look at future society, I was just doing an Extreme E race, which is an electric truck race series I do for McLaren. I was doing it in Saudi Arabia, and it was at um, it's at the building site of the first section of a city called the Line, which is
Yeah.
100+ mile long city.
Yep.
That's 200 meters high, and this so they're not going to really finish this project till like 2055. So they're planning now is really for what's next. And in their mind, people really aren't driving themselves. Cell phones are even outdated. You're not going to carry around a brick to communicate with. You're going to have it's going to be either something
embedded or something.
Yeah, something like that. There's going to be some. So in thinking future proof, do you need people to take themselves to A to B if you really, I mean, are we being nostalgic? The thing that I think is worrisome as a father anyway, is are we missing out? If they don't get that kind of experiential learning and that kind of turning point in their life, or self-created freedom almost, or the control over their own destiny, are they missing out on some sort of development of a part of their brain? Is it important for humans throughout our history? We've always been able to choose if we were going to stand along the edge of something, or hurt our jump off or something. We've had this respect for the physicality of our existence, because we could hurt ourselves if we don't respect it and we don't learn some skill on how to walk right or whatever.
Right.
So you wonder if we do live through screens and interaction digitally, if we do lose a part of our brain development, and we must, in my mind. And
I would agree.
Yeah, so I think to some it really sounds nostalgic for guys like us to be talking about, oh, you need to get a driver's license. How can you not want a driver's license at 16? And shifting gears and all that kind of stuff. It must sound very nostalgic, but I think part of it for me is I really worried that our next generation isn't developing a part of their brain by having that self risk that they control.
Yeah, well, it's almost like it's the combination of what was a sense of adventure for people that came before us. I mean, everybody that decided to go, like when we, in North America, when everybody went west, what did that mean? Well, there was a lot to grapple with. And that just sort of the idea of movement and what that meant, whether it was personalized and you owned and controlled it, or whether it became mass transit and how that worked for your needs. Even your conversation about, the Line in Saudi Arabia and how they're developing that out, is with the vision of where could this go? Could we make it an ecosystem of living that doesn't require all these different pieces that people have to manage on their own? But could we give them a functional way to live, work, and play that is connected? But then to your point, does that open up opportunity for them to think about other things and do other things that are also adventurous? Or is it's so autonomous and so thought for them that we turn into everybody from the movie WALL-E, we're all floating around in those little like hovercraft things. And it's like, we don't do anything physical anymore. We just kind of let it all come to us because we designed it that way. I mean, this is number one, this is super philosophical, and I'm loving the fact that we jumped right into this. So one thing that I think is important too is just speaking to your experience, and for those who don't know your background and the different touch points you've had within motorsport. I mean, everything from Formula D to, you mentioned Extreme E, where you're in now, is kind of, where did you start and how did that phase through for the different touch points of motorsport that you got through, and how did that mold what you're just talking about right now about how you engage with the automobile?
Well, I didn't come from a racing family, so I never saw racing as a viable way to make a living.
Okay.
Growing up, my family, they were all doctors or engineers or scientists, and the so I went to school to be a doctor, and it was in a pre-med major in Boulder. That's what I
Mhm.
graduated undergrad, was at Boulder, with a molecular biology degree, but knew by the time I graduated that I didn't really want to stay in a lab and continue to study medicine. I started working for an inventor who invented amusement rides.
Okay.
And if you've ever worked for somebody like this, it's very contagious when you work for an entrepreneur that just comes up with something super fun and figures out how to make a living doing it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's where that was the first experience I really had with that. So the two things I love to do are ski and drive. And so I got a job as a mechanic at a local track in Colorado, where I volunteered as a mechanic actually in return for seat time. I worked 8 months on these freaking dirty race cars, and I got enough track time to get my license and do one race.
Wow.
But that was the first taste, and that was enough that to realize how expensive motorsport was
Oh
to me.
yeah. Now, was that
Yeah.
before or after you finished school that you did the track, like where you volunteered?
I'd finished school. I had
Wow.
finished school. I'd started working for this inventor. He sold the company
Mhm.
and moved to Florida. I was vested in the company, so I got a check for $8,000 as my
Hey.
profit sharing. I was set for life. That was
Yeah,
more money than
exactly.
I'd even heard of anybody having. So I was like, forget this. I'm out.
Yeah.
I'm volunteering. I just went to the guys. I literally showed up at the racetrack and I told the guy, you don't even have to pay me. I'm set. And I just want to
What a
work on the
time!
cars
What a
and
time
learn.
to be alive. 8
Yeah,
grand, dude. I'm set.
yeah, I am set. That was like probably 10 months of my budget at the time.
Right.
But
Right.
so but I realized very quickly that it's incredibly expensive to race cars. So I got a job at Pikes Peak International Raceway,
Mhm.
which was down in Colorado Springs. It was kind of the biggest racetrack in Colorado, as a sales guy selling sponsorship. And they had an office in
Oh, okay.
Denver. And I learned, really, I got great contacts there. I learned why people spend money on motorsport, why sponsors do.
Mhm.
And that was another critical step towards figuring out how to make a business of motorsport. And then
Yeah.
in the winter, I started working in Steamboat, Colorado, where I'm moving back to here soon, as an ice driving instructor. And that's where I really learned how to talk the talk about car control, vehicle dynamics, and really dissect the physics that go on in driving and in cars.
Yeah.
And so from there, and so maybe that's why I have a little bit of a physiological perspective when it comes to learning and experiential learning. And with my daughter being, just getting her driver's license in the last year, um, and but when I learn driving myself, I think about it from a physiological standpoint, how the eyes work, how we have, evolved as human beings, and how the human condition can hold you back in a car. Really,
Yeah.
99% of the time, it's just trying to hurt you. Um, your own instincts are just wrong all the
Yeah.
time. So I think that's been a critical part of kind of my perspective on racing.
Well, and that's such an interesting take too, because the medical background that you went to school for, and how you describe that. I mean, I would be hard pressed to believe you encounter a lot of other racers that are your counterparts that have that lens. I mean, they're probably the type that grew up, doing kart racing and then just kind of worked their way up through the systems. I'm sure you've encountered that over the years. But as you were describing that, that strikes me that that is a completely different pathway to understand how humans interact with an automobile, and then how you can manipulate it and be prepared to take advantage of it. It just strikes me that it's just a different way to think of it.
Yeah, I mean, you could put 10 racers in the room and everybody has such a varied background,
Yeah.
but with the amount of track time and training and battling with the human condition that all 10 would have had, they're all coming to the same. You could all speak the same language at the end of the day.
Yeah.
even though I come from maybe a scientific or biological perspective, they, through experience, crashing carts since they were
Yeah.
6 years old, feeling where their eyes are telling them where to look and where they know where they should look, they are recognizing the exact same things that I am, although
Just
I'm
different. They got to the end point differently. Yeah.
right. Yeah, where
Yeah.
I'm seeing it from a scientist thing where, they've been studying humans and how we see edges instead of blank spaces.
Mm.
And so like when if you have like a bus or something hit the brakes in front of you, unfortunately the tendency is to swerve just not quite fast enough and hit the edge of the bumper as you go by it.
Right.
While you're on the brakes. And that's because in a stressful situation, your eyes lock onto edges of things. They don't lock into blank spaces. Like if you wanted the car to go into the blank space where it wouldn't hit the bus, you'd have to look at the blank space.
Yeah.
But instead, you look at the edge of the bumper, thinking you're steering enough, but really you're steering right to the edge of the bumper.
Right to the thing you want to be avoiding. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and so but the other racers would certainly recognize that problem with being, a human in a stressful scenario, but maybe they wouldn't have, seen the experiments that they did on, chimpanzees for dozens of years to figure that out.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and to the physiological side of it, when you made the transition and you started racing in Extreme E, or the first time you really started racing and driving electrics, how does the feel of the car from your perspective change then? Because the car is not responding the same way as, for example, from a transmission perspective, shifting perspective, even the feel of the engine and how it's responding to the feel of the vehicle. How did you respond to that? Was that also kind of a physiological response where you had to kind of reassess how to engage with the car?
I think a little bit. It's more about muscle memory. You kind of
Okay.
get used to something, right?
Mm.
And the main difference that I find driving on slippery surfaces, whether it's kind of sand, not sand really, but dirt or something where you have enough power to get wheel spin,
Mm.
there is that when you have gears, the top of that gear is as fast as you can spin the tires if you have a heavy foot. So
Yeah.
if you're in second gear, sliding and exiting a corner, and you're not sensitive to the wheel spin and you add a little bit too much throttle, it's just going to go up to the rev limiter of second gear, which say that's 45 miles an hour. And that's as much wheel spin as you're going to get until you get third gear, and then your potential wheel spin's higher. In an electric car, if you're not sensitive with the throttle, you can get up to 100, whatever the maximum speed is right away.
Yeah.
And so then lifting off to regain grip takes a lot longer. And so you have to be much more sensitive and cognizant of how much potential wheel spin you have under your right foot.
Yeah.
And then and this is what I love about motorsport, is that within the rules, then the teams can shape the throttle curve. They can shape the sensitivity of the throttle based on, maybe where you are on the track or how much resistance the tires are getting, how much grip, just to help you with that throttle management. And then that kind of tech and those lessons learned can make their way into production cars to be beneficial for people driving on the snow or whatever.
Yeah. Well,
But
and to that end too, is you've even got to consider not just on wheel spin, but it's also even, weight ratio for the battery being really low. If you're doing something like drift, for example, how would that differ if you're doing something like Extreme E? Because in Extreme E, I'm thinking that might help with like rollover potentially. But then for drift, is it something where it's just so low? It's like, well, the weight of everything is now directly below me. It's going to therefore dictate how I'm throttling the vehicle. Would that be correct?
in some cases, like with drifting, something extreme like that, it's not a bad idea to have some body roll.
Yeah.
And so having the low center of gravity can make it more tricky. If you imagine in a rallycross car, typically a rallycross car is pretty low, pretty wide. They have a differential between, the left and right tires to minimize the wheel spin that one can take over the other.
Yeah.
But when you have body roll, one contact patch is bigger than the other contact patch. So even though those left and right tires are essentially locked together, when you push the power down, you're getting more power on the outside tire than the inside. So it helps turn the car.
Yeah.
So that body roll can actually be used to help kind of a torque vectoring almost.
So if it's too low, you have to basically figure out how to then rebalance that out. Like what then triggers that opportunity to then, gain that patch and that traction on the outside wheel or tire rather.
Yeah, you're always going to get some load transfer, but when you get to the point where you have so much minimal body roll, yeah, now you're thinking, oh, okay, how can we actively add torque vectoring? Oh, if there's 4 engines, okay, and 4 motors, maybe we can add it. And so we're sort of artificially creating what has been sort of engineered over the last 100 years.
Yeah.
But you can, and that's again how it starts to work. There are some issues. So you take like a typical car out on the road that's got dual motor, right? 2 motors, so it's 4-wheel drive. But unlike a 4-wheel drive road car that's combustion, they don't have a drive shaft usually connecting the front and rear motor.
Right.
So a 4-wheel driven car that's combustion will, if you're accelerating, the front and rear are tied together. Even though you have load transfer to the rear tires, the front tires aren't allowed to just sit there and spin freely because they're connected to the rear that is planted.
Right. Yeah.
With electric dual motor cars that don't have a drive shaft connecting them, as soon as you get on the accelerator coming out of a corner, it's almost like a front wheel drive car because the front can spin up by itself with those smaller contact patches and that load transferring to the rear. So now you have to have this digital traction control that only allows the front to spin maybe 500 or 1,000 RPM more than the rear, and it's kind of like an artificial drive shaft.
It's like, it's all software based now. I mean, it
It's all
really is
software based, right? And you
and I
really
think,
rely on that software, yeah.
well, and that's part of, I mean, companies like, again, I think about the aftermarket and companies like AEM, for example, they're getting into EVs, and I see that could be an opportunity to translate some of what we've seen in the aftermarket, which, and again, in the traditional, let's say the tuner world where I grew up in, it's kind of like, okay, well, this was all based on mechanical engineering. I mean, really, if you think about it, the software side was there. AEM and Greddy and some of these other companies were building out some of those, EMSs and some of those control systems were there, but it still really was based in and around gas and oil and combustion in that way. Whereas with EVs, once you have a high voltage battery pack, kind of how you just described, it's like, well, now you're reimagining how you can understand how to really tune and tweak and manage a vehicle. From a motorsports perspective, I guess, would you say, I mean, is it even close to being the same? Aside from the fact that it's a vehicle with 4 wheels and tires, it's like, yeah, but it's so much more focused on software and digital. And then you can make it respond how you're used to, but how you get there is just completely different. Yeah.
I think you open Pandora's box with a lot of the software capabilities, because when you're dealing just with hardware, differentials, combustion engine stuff, there's just so much you can do. And when it's software, it's like, okay, so now I've got this digital drive shaft connecting the front to the rear.
Yeah.
But what if I want the car to act more rear wheel drive while I have more than 30 degrees of steering angle and I'm on the throttle more than 30%, or whatever the scenario is. So now I can start throwing more power to the rear in certain scenarios where I would already have the load transferred there.
Yeah.
And maybe I want the handling to be different. And then you start to, okay, well, what about yaw? If I have yaw, maybe I want to send some more power to the front. That'll help me save the oversteer a bit. Or if I have understeer, maybe I send the power to the back. So it becomes this limitless thing. And at some point, you take the ultimate tool that the driver has away, which is predictability.
Yeah.
You want the car to basically do what you can anticipate it's going to do.
Yeah.
And if that kind of technology doesn't happen in a seamless way, if it happens just for the sake of doing it because you can, then it starts to become a detriment to the performance and the comfort feeling behind the wheel.
Yeah.
So at that point, the driver will be like, hey, can we just stick a driver shaft in the thing and make
make this easier, please? Yeah. And there's some companies that are approaching that way, like Porsche, for example, even in Taycan. I mean, they actually have a gearbox inside of a Taycan, whereas most other EVs, it's just, nope, you just basically have stop and go, essentially. And so they're trying to implement some of these elements. I guess for the street, we're talking a ton about motorsports, and this, I could go on and on for this. I guess my thought is translating that to an everyday EV experience. Are there any EVs on the road that you've driven that are just, you could go buy it off of a dealer lot that you would say, that actually is the type of vehicle I could say they've understood the performance aspect of this? Because that's probably a complaint we hear often with EVs. It's like, it's just, it doesn't have soul. It's kind of like an appliance. It doesn't respond to me as a driver. Are there vehicles that you've driven that you feel like actually they paid attention to a lot of things that we've just been talking about how to give a driver a better feel?
It's hard to say. I haven't driven all the EVs that are out, and in the Volkswagen group, which I'm still sponsored by Volkswagen, I would say Volkswagen leaves any of that type of feel and real hardcore driver engagement to like the Porsche side
Hmm.
of things. That may not be always the case in the future, but I did do the commercial with Keanu Reeves in the Taycan, and
Hmm.
I was super impressed with that car. It's one of those things that I think the first step when they were coming up with 150, $200,000 EVs is like, let's make this not a big departure from what people expect from Porsche, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
everything's going to feel and smell and seem just like what you're used to. The only difference is you plug it in instead of put fuel in.
Yeah.
And so that makes it feel comfortable. That
Yep.
has to be. The fact is, there's what happens in motorsport in EV and with the boundaries that are being pushed with all those other laws of physics that you can manipulate with the software
Mm.
we were talking about, the torque vectoring and stuff. That's just sort of waiting in the wings
Yeah.
for production cars. I haven't heard of anybody really utilizing that yet.
Yeah.
And um, will that happen while we're still driving them ourselves? I hope so.
While we're still
And
driving them ourselves. I love that though. It's
yeah,
like before I just like hit the button, it's like, I don't need to be performance oriented. I'm just taking you to the grocery store. Yeah.
yes. So I mean, I hope so, and I think that it will be fairly eye opening. I mean, even just in okay, now I'm not just plugging sponsors, but in the Volkswagen Golf R, which is a combustion car,
Yeah.
that is one of the few cars out there that does have an active differential that
Hmm.
does send more power to the outside tire in a corner than the inside tire.
Hmm.
And so that's an active torque vectoring system, and it's only on the rear. It's but it makes such a big difference in the driving dynamics at the limit
Hmm.
that it's incredible, especially in wet or snowy conditions or even gravel.
Yeah.
It just makes you a better driver than you really are. And
Yeah.
then if you were to go take that to where EVs can go, where you could have four motors and really manipulate that torque vectoring, the steering
Yeah.
wheel is really kind of secondary at that point. It just sort of starts the corner, and then the torque vectoring is really what does it. It does
Yeah.
the turning at the limit. So it kind of, I think we step into a whole another level of physics that are available,
Yeah.
and that's going to be interesting if that makes it into motorsport soon.
Well, and it's so funny because you even go back just 10 years, 5 years, 10 years. There have been people that have been putting together, for example, dragster EVs off of just parts they were finding off of whatever they could get. One guy I think was up in Canada built, a little drag EV off of a Model S motor and like old batteries from a Chevy Bolt. And it was like, hey man, I'm only going a quarter mile. I don't need this battery to be gigantic. I just want to make it go fast. You know,
Yeah.
and so it's going to be interesting to see how that requires a prowess still in mechanical engineering to a point, but then you get to the place of the software we're talking about. That is a whole new expertise that I think a lot of folks are, maybe from, for people that we've known for a long time in the industry, that's a reimagining of what they've been doing. But there's this whole generation coming up that is going to basically be living through that process that we've been talking about, and they may become perfect experts at it and say, oh no, I could totally reprogram this thing right now to do exactly what you're talking about. Give me 30 seconds and I'll write a new line of code. And it's just like, wow, this is totally different from what we did back in like the late 90s.
It's true, but there is this fork where the engineers know they can do it a certain way, and the drivers, the further down the road and the closer to the limit that you get of what you can get out of these four contact patches, they want it to be predictable in a certain way.
Yeah.
And even if you're pitching it in sideways, is that going to be within the realm of what that code is, or is that code going to try to fix it itself and make it feel kind of mysterious and unpredictable to the driver,
Yeah.
et cetera. And so then that's why I say hopefully we're driving it ourselves still when we
Right.
really get this seamless kind of interaction happening. There was a series, and I think it was RoboCar. That was there was
Hmm.
talk about this series happening. I know they went out and did some events, but they were doing like, I think if I'm remembering this right, for example, 10 laps with a driver driving
Yeah.
a single seat formula car,
Yeah.
getting out, and then the car drove itself for 10 laps and raced against the other cars that
Okay.
were didn't have drivers in them.
Yeah.
And so I assume that they learn stuff on the grip and everything of the track at that moment by the human driver. But they had obviously collected a huge amount of data about the track.
It makes me wonder too, is that if you think about artificial intelligence applications for how it can be responding to the input it's getting based on software and just based on data, is could an AI basically be thinking on your behalf inside of an electric car that you're racing to see how you as a driver are trying to push different elements of the vehicle and then respond, as you said, like the engineers, you're going to diverge. The engineers are going to say, well, we're going to do this way. And the driver's going to say, yeah, but this is the response. And this is what I'm looking for as a driver. Is there opportunity for an AI to basically do not the thinking on behalf of the driver, but to basically understand the feel of a particular driver and say, like we just did 3 laps and this is the feedback I was getting, and by this getting from the driver, the AI could say, I can make those tweaks right now based on the type of input I was getting from where the steering was, where the throttle was, etc. And then could that AI make those adjustments? And I think that's a huge opportunity. I mean, we're kind of getting off into the realm of like, supercomputing at this point, but I wonder if that could be applied that way. Because then at that point, it is responding not by an engineer saying, we want to just do this. It's an AI saying, no, but this is what the driver was doing. I could sense it.
I am not super well versed on AI, but I do know that with textual based AI, it seems like it as a sample of its latest information that it's using to base its next decision on. Sometimes it's sampling its own misinformation. And so it can possibly veer off into, start forking away from optimized, going down another road. But and then feedback from a driver can be difficult to interpret. Guilty. It's just difficult communication sometimes. But if you're just interpreting the inputs of the driver and recognizing why those inputs happen, there's probably enough variability in human inputs that it would take a pretty big sampling to get something that was really at the limit of a top percent driver. But I mean, I assume that that's being explored.
We're at the beginning of that conversation right now. I mean, everything you've like ChatGPT and just kind of like, well, oh my gosh, this thing could write me a poem. It's like, that's fine. But the stuff we're talking about is really, it's taking not a text input, but an actual active input of something that's reading its data in real time and then giving feedback on. I think we're oftentimes having conversations in the EV space and with the work that I do around how are people going to respond to everything we're talking about. And oftentimes it just becomes, I mean, motorsports as a niche, this is a threat to a lot of people's basically experience for what they've done with as a career for what motorsports has been, because everything we're talking about is just different. It's a very different way to think about it. And in the same way, it turns to the same conversation for everyday people that are buying and driving everyday cars is, well, this is a car still, right? Or is it actually that much different? And I think part of what happens when technology starts to evolve this way is cars have been the same way for 100 years. If you really get down to brass tacks, 4 wheels, brake, accelerator, steering wheel, and you put gas in it and it works. The manipulation and the customization and what created unique brands and nameplates was on the creativity of those different people that were basically saying, we're going to take an engine and build it this way, or we're going to take a suspension and dial it in this way. Everything else we're talking about now is in that digital realm in a lot of ways that most people just throw their hands in the air and say, I don't get it. Like, I know digital's there and it works, but I don't necessarily engage with it that way. This all sounds like you could be speaking Greek, and I don't know what you're saying. And I think it's interesting because we're at the beginning of it.
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, I will say that drivers anticipate things, and that's once AI driving gets to the point where it can anticipate what's happening mid-slide, then that's a whole nother world. That's really the difference between a driver who has the perfect reaction to everything is never going to be the quickest or best. The one that knows can feel where the inertia is going, what the grip looks like right there, and can anticipate exactly how that's going to affect the attitude of the car, then that's where the level doesn't exist, I think, in automation. But to your point, though, I do a race called the NORA 1000. This year we're doing the NORA 500. I do this for Volkswagen, and we take an EV and we do it. We go down to Mexico. We've got the record for the longest EV in a race down there. The previous record was 47 miles. and we did 1,140 miles, which was the completion of the race.
Yeah.
But one thing I never really thought about once you got out there, because it is just a steering wheel, pedals, and some tires, it does feel just like a regular car. Once you get out there in the middle of Mexico, and in some points in Baja, if you break down, you're spending the night, because they have rules against flying at night there. You can't fly helicopters, you can't fly cars or fly airplanes at night, and so certainly not cars quite yet. But they and so there is this, like, don't hit anything, don't crash, don't break down, and you see people breaking down, and I didn't expect to, but in the EV, you start to think about what could break down. Like, there's very few moving parts.
Right.
There's very few things just rubbing against each other that could wear out. Right. And it's just it was I think that's what we really kind of proved for VW anyway, is that off-roading is a great way to showcase the reliability of EV, just because of the nature of the beast, that there's not you're not going to overheat the oil, you're not going to go low on this fluid or that fluid, and
well, it's a rotor and a stator and a high voltage battery making it just spin, right? That's the argument's been made for so long for so many people that are EV advocates who have said this is why it's so beautiful, is because it has so many fewer moving parts, like 90% fewer moving parts, and that's true. But then to your point about, so you guys went 1,100 miles in that race. One of the first questions that I think anybody would ask is, so did that battery pack have 1,100 miles on it, or did you guys recharge it? And if you recharge it, how'd you guys do that in the middle of nowhere in Mexico?
Yeah, we recharged it every 150 miles or so, which is about the same duration that a race truck could get out of a tank of fuel.
Yeah.
But we had to average, it was a stock car pretty much. Very little suspension travel. It was just basically reinforced skid plates and suspension arms and stuff. And so our speed was really limited by the fact that we couldn't hit compressions or bumps very fast. And because our speed was limited, our range was great. The faster you go, the shorter the range.
Oh, yeah.
Then we developed a charger that was in a trailer, and that race is stage by stage. So I did this with Reese Millen Racing, was based in Huntington Beach. And we shoot commercials and movies. We both stunt drive in that industry. And we literally took basically a generator on the back of a truck that they used for film sets, and pulled a trailer with it, with an inverter, and we trailered it from one stage to the next, charging it in the trailer stages. And as crude as that is, that's how early day exploration of using a technology in a place that doesn't have the infrastructure to support it. That's how that works. So it was very early days. It was very inexpensive. When I did it, I was thinking 5 years from now, this is going to be cheaper to race Baja electric than it is combustion. That may have been a little soon, probably a little longer than that. But charging systems, portable charging systems, are getting so much faster and better that I think every year you're going to see more and more EVs down there racing. And it's strange that you wouldn't think endurance off-road is being like a place where EV racing is going to break through. But it makes a lot of sense down there, just because it saves you so much money on the mechanical side of things.
Right. Well, it's that balancing act of where's the cost savings coming from? It's like, well, we could have this cheap fuel that's readily available, and then X amount of thousands of moving parts, or we could have basically a handful of moving parts, and then maybe pay a little bit extra to have the fuel available for us at each stop. Right. Yeah. It's funny. The fuel conversation comes up so often with folks that are just new to this conversation about EVs. And I think you made a good point about how the Volkswagen Group approached ID4 and some of their platform approaches. They said, we don't want to make this feel too different from what people have been used to. When you get into an ID4, for example, it feels just like a car. I mean, it's got a little screen, two little screens going on. The shifter's a little bit quirky, but aside from that, once you're on the road, this thing feels pretty familiar. Whereas some of the new EVs that are coming out, they are, I mean, Tesla's as an example. You could look at Lucid and Rivian. They are meant to sort of feel familiar, but they're very software based, very screen focused, very digital focused, no tactile buttons, for example. Right. And I think that's something that I think it's important that the legacy brands are taking what their knowledge is around, and whether we're talking about an everyday car or even for motorsports, just saying, what do we know does work that we're really good at, and how do we make this work for everybody that we're trying to target with this particular application? And I think that the benefits, as you described for the race you ran, of just how, well, yeah, once you can apply it the right way and then say, gosh, you know what, this is, yeah, there's not a lot that could break on this thing. So if we could really focus on how we fill this thing back up with electrons whenever we decide to stop, I think it's an interesting thought, because you're in the middle of nowhere, but you're at this, at this really long race. But the logistics of the fuel, once that's answered, then all of a sudden the racing aspect of it becomes less of a headache. You're just kind of like,
And
no,
way
now,
more
yeah,
accessible.
yeah, without a doubt. So I guess that's. You also mentioned that you and Reese Millen were in the race together, and you mentioned you guys have done stunt driving. So I have to ask. So a really really good friend of mine I went to school with turned me on to the Ford versus Ferrari film. So now, did you do stunt driving in that as well?
Yeah, I was one of the stunt drivers. There were a lot of us.
Okay.
I played a role in that film, which if you blink, you miss it. Which was Ronnie Bucknam. He finished third, but drove quite a few of the cars, almost all of them at one point.
Yeah.
And that those films, sometimes the bigger films that have A-list actors, there's a lot more focus on the actual dialogue, because they got to take advantage of those A-list actors, and less focus on a lot of the action.
Yeah.
But still was great, amazing film to work on. I've always loved that story.
Oh, it's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, and so cool to be a part of them bringing it to film.
Well, and that's, I mean, for the films that we're talking about, this is a historical story, a lot of heritage there, everything, for the Ford, how they finally came out and beat Ferrari. But then you look at where, I remember the story when it came out, when they refilmed the Italian Job, and they had the minis in the, like underground in LA. And those were electric back then when they filmed that movie back in like 2001 or two, because they didn't want the emissions underground while they were filming. And I remember the first time I read that, I was kind of like, well, I guess it makes sense, but like that's an application for EVs I would have thought of.
Right. Yeah. Stunt cars. I mean, there are a lot of EVs now in stunts, mostly camera cars. So a lot of people are developing various versions of camera cars that are nice and quiet. There's a lot of people standing around them and everything. And so it's nice that the thing's not just sitting there running.
Yeah.
And they accelerate quick. I think they're very easy to match speed. A lot of a camera car just is placement. It's like a cameraman on wheels. So it's got to be placed perfectly. So without having to worry about whether the turbo's spooling up or not, et cetera, they can place those cameras perfectly. So EV is definitely making its way into Hollywood. Not to mention that in the commercial world, agencies are much more cognizant of how green various production houses are. Yeah. And I don't know if they're bidding, choosing bids based on that, but it's certainly, that's the next step. So,
I would say that the one thing that often happens in EVs too is that you have the opportunity to apply environmental thinking to anything, right? Whether it's movie productions or things along those lines. I think that the way that we were just talking about motorsports and the preciseness that it can offer if you understand how to do it, it may not be that we're there yet for motorsports, but as you just described, you're like, no, this thing is just a trailing vehicle and it just has to go X miles an hour. We got to get up to that speed in X amount of seconds. Well, with an EV, it's like, yeah, we can calculate that pretty accurately without goofing that up. So that application is beautiful, right?
Yeah, I think people like driving them. Yeah.
Yeah.
The camera car operators like driving them, and they do the job well. There's constant. I mean, I've been on at least half a dozen camera car tryouts where Need for Speed. They're like, oh, we're going to be shooting everything at 100+ miles an hour. We need a camera car like nobody has ever developed before. We got a Ferrari here with a camera mounted on the hood. We've got this Mustang with a camera car integrated. And so you go to the racetrack and the camera cars show how fast they can go to keep up. And then you get on set and you shoot it all at 60 anyway, but you try for 100. Right. But so there always is this desire to push the limits, and EVs have opened up a lot of doors there. I think we're starting to see the first Rivians probably come out as camera cars. Trucks are always trucks and SUVs are the typical ones. One, because they can hold a director and DP and everything in them, and two, because you can park them up on the sidewalk and get a good angle and have them come down a little hill, and they're a lot more versatile than some of the car based ones. But yeah, Hollywood may not be the quickest at adopting new technology, but there's a lot of innovation that happens in the wings there.
Oh yeah.
And Yeah, I think the first electric vehicle I ever saw was a camera car in Hollywood. Probably was Tokyo Drift.
Oh,
We
wow.
used like a little electric car to do some of the scenes with crowds and stuff and drifting around. That was the third Fast and Furious, and I don't
Yeah.
remember what year that was, but it was a while ago.
I was going to say, yeah, I mean, not maybe close to 20 years ago now. And that's what's amazing is time
Really?
yeah, I know, right? You think about it, it's like, I'm like, well, the first one was 2000, summer of 2001, I think. So, and what are they on now? Fast and Furious, what is it, 10, 11?
10,
I was, yeah, I keep losing
hands out.
track.
Yeah.
I mean, credit to the franchise. I mean, looking back on that, I mean, I remember when it was filmed. I mean, I grew up in Lancaster Pondale, going to like LACR on Grudge Night on Fridays, and I remember watching the movie in the theater in Pondale when he goes, "You know what it ran in Pondale," and the whole theater like loses its mind, like we've made it. I'm thinking, if
We've made it.
we've
Yeah.
made it, I'm like, if Afro Man and Pondale mentioned in Fast and Furious is how we've made it. I don't know if this is something we hang our hat on, everybody, but okay.
It's
So
honestly, it's been downhill from there.
I,
It's
I love I still love the first one. I mean, it is Point Break with cars, but it's beautiful.
No, the
It's
franchise is great. And what
yeah.
it's done for the automotive industry, I mean,
Oh,
at that point, that is cars were not bankable anymore. You
not
know,
really. Yeah,
yeah, after, Blues Brothers, since then, cars were kind of Dukes of Hazzard kicked in there, but that Knight Rider maybe,
yeah,
but they were not that bankable. And Fast and Furious suddenly made cars bankable again, and
yeah.
suddenly networks were like, "Oh, we need to do car shows." That's how Top Gear, came back to the U.S.
Okay.
After they had kind of a missed attempt in Discovery Channel days. And when we first did the Top Gear pilot, it was actually for NBC,
Okay.
for network television. That was a big deal for a you know non-scripted show to go at that time. This is before kind of reality TV was taking over the
Yeah.
ratings. But then they revamped Knight Rider. Everybody started throwing money back into car shows, and I think that helped keep this current generation of
Hmm.
car enthusiasts. It kept them going, and
Yeah.
now what we're talking about, and what we see with what people do with either their hot rods or with EVs or whatever, how they modify them at SEMA and this and that,
Mm.
that is going to be responsible for kickstarting the next generation of enthusiasts and hopefully
Yeah.
keeping them interested in driving cars.
Well, I don't think we're too far gone yet. I think, in fact, what I think's happening is people are rediscovering these tactile things that their parents loved. These younger generations that didn't grow up like in love with cars. But for example, like last year, records outsold CDs for the first time in like 35 years or something like that. They're like, vinyl is back, baby. And I'm thinking, well, yeah, because if you live your entire life through a screen, it's almost like the moment you discover this thing outside of the filter you had through a screen, it's a new feeling. But to your point, it's past when they were kids doing it like we were. Now they're
Mhm.
older, but they're going, gosh, you can do that with music. Yeah, you don't just have to have your iPhone. You can literally like have a device that plays this stuff. And by the way, on vinyl, it sounds great. And in the same way, I think that's the argument people make about, well, yeah, EVs don't have sound. They don't respond. Like you can't respond with the five senses the way that you do to a combustion engine vehicle. And so I think there's place for gas powered motorsports in a way that there's always going to be a draw there and a tug there. But I love seeing things like Formula E and Extreme E because it's this introduction of a new way of thinking about how motorsports can work. And I think that the people that have been coming up and seeing movies like we were talking about, just kind of like where automotive has been in this line of like the last 20 years, whether it's been film or not, cars aren't going away. Here in America, it's Americana, it's part of American culture. But how people value them and where they see them fitting into their life might be different. But I don't necessarily foresee that it's just going to vanish overnight. I think it's just going to be a different way to appreciate what they can be in like whether it's your everyday life or maybe it's an enthusiast type thing, whether it's tuning like you said for like SEMA, going to car shows like Honda Port Night stuff back in the day. I mean I still see all the people with Teslas that are modifying Model 3 and Model Y now. It's like the same crowd. Some of them are new and younger, but some of these folks, like these are like hot and port night people that I knew like 20 years ago who are like, well, yeah, now I have the disposable income to actually buy all the stuff I want for this thing.
Right,
So
right.
I'm,
Yeah.
so I'm going to modify the heck out of it. So I don't see it going away. I just think we've just sort of like shifted the timeline by which people engage with vehicles. But full circle
Yeah,
to the movie conversation, I think it's because they still see them as an extension of who they are, I
for
guess.
sure. And Fast and Furious really did put light on that they were almost a fashion accessory, and your
Yeah.
car was a statement of who you were. Yeah, I remember a book I saw in college. It was like, "You are what you drive," and it sort of stereotyped every car type, and it was hilarious and
Yeah.
true. But
Yeah.
and it, I made a joke a couple times on Top Gear that every like Subaru STI owners were always IT guys, and there are like a lot of you laughed because you probably know a couple, and
Oh,
it's
yeah, no,
weird
I
how it
know, but
works.
yeah.
Yeah, but but then personalizing them, of course, is a natural thing. I'm surprised it's taken so long for me to see Teslas modified around here in Orange County. I saw one yesterday, and now I see them every day at some point. But
It
yeah,
it
and
it,
that's
it
one thing that
lent
we
to
do
it.
in the States. Yeah,
What's that?
that's one thing that we do in the States with cars.
Yeah.
From the beginning, and you go to Germany. I used to give this spiel when I used to do these ride and drive events for BMW, and I used to do this spiel where we talk about how in the U.S. we modified, we'd put bigger wheels or whatever on our tires as a statement. When they put the bigger wheels and tires on their cars in Germany, it was so they could shave 3 minutes off their commute time to work,
Yeah.
and like everything was about function and purpose. And they're on the autobahn, they're driving 100% all the time, kind of a thing. It's a little bit
Yeah.
more trafficy now, but that there's kind of a cultural difference there. But here we do have this critical extension of, just like you said, extension of who you are represented in your car.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's a big tank of fuel keeping the fire of automotive industry going here. So it's
Yep. Well, and EVs, they're going to be a part of that, but it's going to be interesting to see how it transitions, because there will be purists who fight the idea of you can't make that an exciting vehicle. But some of the EVs, I mean, that's what I'm excited about for Electrify Expo this year. The Electrify show off element is really shining a light on the fact there's people that have been doing this that are tuners. They've been doing this for years already, saying no, but like you can still do this. I'm not too keen on the fake motor and exhaust sounds just yet. I don't think that's something I'm going to fall in love with, where you can like attach an
yeah.
exhaust to a Model 3. I'm like, no, don't do that.
There is
But
a movie, by the way. I'm sorry that I don't know the name of it, but it's Paul Blart Mall Cop, that guy, and Vince Vaughn are engineers, and they are charged with coming up with a sound for the Charger. They literally shot it in the Chrysler building. I think Salt and Pepper in there somewhere.
Yeah, what is that movie called? Yeah.
I can't remember the name of it.
We'll
Anyway,
have it in the notes.
it was 12 years after the scene was done in the whatever showroom at the Chrysler Center, that in reality there was the actual CEO of Chrysler or of whatever department in that exact same room in a Charger, sitting there revving a fake sound card, just like they did in the movie. Like 12 years later, and nobody ever called that out. Like, this was 12 years ago in the same freaking room doing the exact same thing in a movie. And part of me, I feel like movies are just, controlled by aliens, and they just are telling us our future. Like iRobot. Yeah, come on. iRobot. This is like, we're going to be taking self-driving cars is going to be unheard of and super dangerous. Like, part of me, I'm kind of like, look at that stuff, and I kind of, when I get science fictiony about it, I sort of love looking to movies as inspiration of what the possible future is like. And I love how much work movies put into making the future look in a way that is possibly believable based on fact.
Oh yeah, well the authenticity of where could we actually take this, not being overly outlandish. And to your point, like, look, this is 12 years ago, and no one brought it up, which I think is bonkers. But at the same time, too, if you look at the visionaries and storytellers who have said, like, this is where I think we could take society, it's almost like it becomes like subconsciously ingrained in people. And then someone has an idea 12 years later, you know what we should do? We should have that event right here in the
Right?
this room, and you're going, I feel like we've seen this before.
Yeah. Oh, it's going to be amazing. We're going to catch everybody by surprise. No, 12 years later is unbelievable. I can't.
It's like Matt Groening from The Simpsons, who's just kind of like, yeah, I was going to call that one, but I let someone else have it. Because all I got to do is watch The Simpsons, and you're like, you're going to know what's going to happen in the next century of America, basically.
That's funny.
So, well, dude, this has been an awesome conversation, man. I really was excited to chat with you today. I guess closing question: if there was an EV on the road that you thought, okay, I'd put that in my garage. If you don't have one yet, which one would it be? And then also, which one do you think we could get Adam to drive? I mean, honestly.
Is there a Cadillac EV coming out? There must be.
The Lyric. Yeah, the Lyric. But it's an SUV. You know, it's probably maybe not his flavor.
Yeah, he's getting old. He can't sit down in cars anymore.
He gets it like slide in, not get down into it. Yeah.
Actually, I don't know if he's getting older. He doesn't seem like he is getting older, strangely enough. I do like the Taycan. I have since that commercial.
Yep.
And I still think it's one of the best all-rounders out there. Mm-hmm. I will say that one of the things I like about my ID4, a little bit on brand, but is that the battery is smaller and I can charge it at home. And it doesn't matter how low it is, I can charge it overnight. And so I don't, I hear about, issues at charging stations and things like that, and I just don't have to worry about that. So I will say that I do kind of see myself sticking with something with a smaller battery for a while, not necessarily having a discipline to always plug it in every night. But yeah, that's the Taycan. I think that was a phenomenal car, and I wish I would have got one when they were not selling very well.
well, yeah. Now you're speaking to my heart when you're talking about charging and how that works. But we can have you back for another show to talk about all that, because that's the hot topic of how do you make this thing work, But for another day. But on that note, for everybody who's listening, thanks again for listening to the Electrify News podcast. Be sure to check us out on wherever podcasts are sold. You can pick us up on Spotify, Apple iTunes, etc. And also be sure to follow Electrify Expo on all social media channels. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and also for all 7 cities where Electrify Expo will be held this year, be sure to go to electrifyexpo.com to get your tickets today. And Tanner, again, thank you so much for coming by the show.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed the conversation. Hope everybody else did too. And we'll see you again on the next episode.
All right. Thank you.